I'm not a big reader. At least, I wasn't until a few months ago when I stumbled into a tiny bookstore that somehow felt like it was pulled straight out of some old black and white movie. I wasn't looking for anything in particular, just killing time on a Saturday afternoon after a rough week. I figured maybe a change of scenery would help. Turns out it did, though not the way I expected. The place was squeezed between a greasy diner and a dusty tailor shop on a side street you'd probably miss if you blinked. It had one of those old wooden signs hanging above the door that creaked every time the wind caught it. The windows were fogged and cluttered with stacks of books and little trinkets that looked like they'd been there since forever. I pushed the door open, and this bell chimed softly. Nothing fancy, just enough to announce my entrance. Inside smelled like old paper, vanilla, and this faint hint of tobacco smoke. The walls were lined with shelves, so crammed with books they looked like they might collapse at any moment. It wasn't the kind of place you'd expect a 20-something like me to hang out, but something about it drew me in. Behind the counter was a guy in his early 30s, maybe a bit older. He had this kind of scruffy charm, the kind you see in pictures of writers or artists. Messy dark hair that looked like it hadn't seen a comb in days, clear eyes behind round glasses, and a faint smile that felt both warm and a little mysterious. He was carefully flipping through an old copy of some poetry book when I walked in, and I caught him glancing up as I hesitated near the entrance. "Looking for anything in particular?" he asked without sounding pushy, just genuinely curious. "Not really," I said, feeling a bit awkward. "Just wandering, I guess." He closed the book and stood, dusting off his hands on his shirt. "Well, wandering's half the fun around here. You never know what you might find." That's when he said it. The thing that stopped me in my tracks, made me suddenly aware of how I looked standing there, like some character in one of those old novels stacked all around us. "You've got that kind of face," he said, almost like he was reading me. "The kind that belongs in stories." I blinked. "Excuse me?" He smiled, this time a little softer, like he was letting me in on a secret. "Yeah, you know. The kind of face that looks like you've got a story to tell. Maybe a few, even." I laughed nervously, unsure if he was serious or just being poetic for the sake of the shop's vibe. But there was something in his gaze, something genuine and unforced, that kept me rooted there. "Do you always say that to people who walk in?" I asked. He shrugged. "Only to the ones who seem like they mean it." And with that, he gestured toward a crooked shelf piled high with old, worn-out copies of classic novels. "Pick one. Maybe you'll find the story you're looking for." I didn't know it then, but that moment was the start of something that would change everything. Not just the books I'd come to love, but the guy behind the counter, the one with the vintage shop and the way he saw stories in faces. And maybe, just maybe, I was about to become one of his stories. I hesitated for a moment before stepping closer to the shelf. The books there looked like they'd been rescued from a thrift store's last chance pile, some with cracked spines, some with handwritten notes tucked between pages, others with faded dust jackets that made you wonder about their previous owners. I ran my fingers along them, the textured covers almost whispering stories I hadn't even read yet. "Any recommendations?" I asked, glancing back at him. He tapped the counter thoughtfully. "Depends. What kind of story are you in the mood for? Mystery? Romance? Something that makes you think?" I shrugged. "Honestly, I don't know. Something real, I guess." He nodded like that was the best answer he could have hoped for. "Okay, how about this one?" He reached over and pulled out a worn, leather-bound novel with no title on the spine. "It's a bit obscure, but the story's raw and honest." I took the book from him, surprised by how heavy it felt in my hands. "What's it called?" "The Last Summer," he said, eyes lighting up. It's about a guy who's trying to figure out who he is before everything changes. That line hit closer to home than I expected. I was in one of those trying to figure out phases myself. Just graduated, job hunting, and honestly feeling a little lost. Sometimes I wondered if I was just drifting without any real direction. I looked up at him, a bit less awkward now. "Sounds familiar," I said with a small smile. He returned it. "Maybe that's why I thought you might like it." I nodded and carried the book over to a battered armchair in the corner. The chair looked like it had been someone's favorite for decades, the kind of place where you could get lost for hours. I sank into it and cracked open the book, the scent of aged paper filling my nose. As I read the first few pages, I felt a strange calm settle over me. It was like the story was pulling me in, inviting me to sit with my own thoughts. A few minutes later, I heard footsteps approaching. The guy was back behind the counter, idly flipping through another book, but every now and then, his eyes flicked toward me. After what felt like forever, he came over and sat on the armrest beside me. "So," he said, "do you come here often, now that you've found us?" I laughed. "I don't know yet. I'm not usually the type to hang out in bookshops," he grinned. "Most people aren't, but something tells me you're different." I raised an eyebrow at him. "And what's that based on?" "The kind of face theory?" He chuckled. "Maybe. Or maybe because you actually picked up a book instead of just browsing your phone like everyone else." Touché. He was right. We got to talking then, about books, music, the neighborhood, and eventually, more personal stuff. His name was Liam, and the shop had been his family's for years. He inherited it from his dad, who'd started it in the 70s. Liam told me he loved the idea of keeping stories alive, not just in books, but in the people who read them. There was something poetic about it, even if he didn't put it exactly that way. Before I knew it, the afternoon light was fading, the shop's warm glow inviting but hinting at closing time. "You can't just disappear after that kind of face compliment," Liam said with a teasing smile. I smiled back, feeling a little braver than I had when I walked in. "I guess I'll have to come back." "Good," he said, "because I think there's more stories for you here." Over the next few weeks, I found myself making more excuses to visit the shop. Sometimes it was just to grab a book, other times to chat or sneak in a coffee from the diner next door. Liam and I developed this easy rhythm. No pressure, just two people sharing space and stories. One night, the shop had closed, but Liam invited me to stick around while he organized some new arrivals. I helped unpack boxes, laughing at titles neither of us had heard of before. When we finally paused, he pulled me aside, eyes shining in the soft lamplight. "You have that look on your face again," he said softly. "Like you're about to ask something, but don't know how." I swallowed, suddenly nervous. "Is that true? The face thing?" He nodded. "Yeah. You're not just any face. You've got layers. I want to know them." I looked at him, a little breathless. "Why me?" "Because I see stories in people, but with you, it's like the story is just waiting to be written." There was a quiet charge between us then, the kind that makes you realize things are shifting. I wasn't sure what the next chapter looked like, but standing there in that little vintage bookshop with Liam, I felt like maybe I was ready to find out. I remember standing there, the soft glow of the lamps casting long shadows across the stacks of books, with Liam's words hanging between us. "You've got layers," he said, like it was some sort of revelation. Honestly, I wasn't sure how to respond. It was the kind of thing you hear in movies or read in poems, not something that lands in the middle of your life on a random Tuesday night. I cleared my throat, trying to push past the sudden tightness in my chest. "Layers, huh? Sounds like you're describing an onion." He laughed, a genuine laugh that made his eyes crinkle at the corners. "An onion? I guess. But the kind that's worth peeling." I smiled, feeling this strange mix of nerves and something else. "Hope, maybe. So, what happens if I don't want to be peeled?" He shrugged, but his smile softened. "Then I'll wait. Stories don't always need to be rushed." For the first time in a long time, I felt like someone was actually interested in knowing me. Not the surface stuff, but the messier, complicated parts. One usually kept locked away. The shop's bell jingled, pulling us apart. A customer, I guessed. Liam moved to the counter, and I took the chance to glance around. The space suddenly felt different, charged with the possibility of something new. I decided to take a chance, the kind I usually avoided. "Hey, Liam," I started, then stopped, suddenly self-conscious. He looked over, eyebrows raised in that inviting way. "Yeah? Would you want to grab a coffee sometime? Like, outside the shop?" He paused, as if sizing me up, then nodded slowly. "Yeah, I'd like that." The next week felt like a weird blur of anticipation and awkward rehearsals in my head. What would I say? What should I wear? How do you not sound like a total mess? I showed up at the little cafe across the street, heart pounding, and there he was already waiting. One of those big, warm smiles on his face that makes your stomach flip. We talked for hours, under the soft hum of the cafe's jazz playlist, not really about books this time, but about our lives, our failures, the stuff that doesn't usually come out in casual chats. Liam told me about his dreams for the shop, the pressure of keeping a family legacy alive, and how sometimes he wondered if he'd ever find someone who saw him for more than just a bookstore owner. I surprised myself by opening up too, about feeling lost after college, about the pressure to have everything figured out, about the loneliness that sometimes crept in even when I was surrounded by people. There was this moment when we both got quiet, just looking at each other across the table like we were both waiting for permission to cross some invisible line. I wanted to reach out, to close the distance, but I hesitated. Liam leaned forward, his voice a whisper. You know, not everyone gets told they have a face made for stories. I smiled, feeling a blush creeping up my neck. Guess I'm lucky. He reached across and lightly brushed a stray curl behind my ear. The touch was electric, like a spark jolting through me. I don't believe in luck, he said softly. I believe in moments. That night, walking home, I replayed everything in my head. The way he looked at me, how natural it felt to be around him. For once, the future didn't seem so scary or uncertain. It felt like maybe I was exactly where I was supposed to be. Over the next few weeks, things between us unfolded slowly but beautifully. We'd meet at the shop after hours, sometimes just sitting in comfortable silence, surrounded by the smell of old pages and dust. I learned about the rare books he collected, the stories behind each one, and the little rituals he had, like how he'd always arrange the poetry section on Thursdays or how he'd read out loud when he was feeling stuck. One evening, as rain tapped gently against the windows, Liam pulled out a battered notebook and passed it to me. Here, he said, I want to hear your story. I stared at the blank pages, suddenly self-conscious. I don't know if I have one worth telling. He smiled, that same patient, gentle smile. Everyone does. You just have to start. So I started writing. Not for anyone else, just for me. And with each word, I felt a little lighter, a little more like myself. One night, after I'd been coming to the shop for a couple of months, Liam surprised me with a little gift, a first edition copy of The Great Gatsby. The edges were worn, the pages yellowed, but it had a kind of magic to it. I thought it might remind you, he said, that even the most complicated stories can have beautiful parts. I looked up at him, my heart too full for words. Thank you. He smiled, and I felt like I was seeing him for the first time. Not just as the guy who ran a vintage bookshop, but as someone I wanted to know more deeply. And just like that, I realized that sometimes the best stories aren't in the pages of a book. They're the ones you write together. The weeks after that felt like something out of a daydream I never thought I'd have. Liam and I fell into an easy routine, like two old friends who'd somehow found a new way to be close. We'd meet at the shop almost every day after I finished work, or sometimes he'd text me when he found something interesting buried in a box of donations. I loved those texts. Sometimes just a photo of a faded cover, or a quote scribbled in the margins, but always with a little note from him underneath. One rainy Thursday evening, I showed up at the shop with a nervous energy I couldn't quite shake. Liam was at the counter, running his fingers over the spine of an ancient book. When he looked up and saw me, his face lit up like the whole place had just been flooded with sunlight. Hey, he said softly. You okay? I nodded, even though my stomach was doing somersaults. I'd been thinking about something for days, something I hadn't dared say out loud yet. Can we talk? I asked, my voice a little shaky. He pushed the book aside and gestured toward the armchair. Always. I settled into the chair, clutching my jacket like a lifeline. It's just, I really like this. Us. And I don't want to mess it up. Liam sat down across from me, leaning forward. Why would you mess it up? I shrugged, feeling suddenly exposed. I don't know. I've been burned before. I'm not great at this whole relationship thing. He smiled, but there was a softness in his eyes that made me want to be brave. Nobody's great at it all the time. The important part is that you want to try. I looked down at my hands, then back up. I want to try. With you. There was a beat of silence, but it didn't feel heavy or awkward. It felt like something fragile and important was settling between us. Good, he said quietly. Because I want that too. From that night on, things shifted in a way that was subtle but undeniable. We stopped pretending this was all just casual hanging out and started building something real. We shared meals, long walks, and lazy Sundays where the world outside the shop faded into nothing. One evening, Liam invited me over to his apartment. It was a cozy space, walls lined with bookshelves that overflowed with every kind of story imaginable. There was this old record player in the corner, and he played me vinyls that somehow felt like soundtracks to our own quiet little moments. We cooked dinner together, laughing over burnt garlic bread and too salty pasta, and I realized I was starting to think of him as more than just the bookstore guy with the charming smile. He was becoming the person I wanted to come home to. But just as things were settling into something comfortable, I started noticing these small moments when Liam would get quiet, like he was wrestling with something. One night, as we sat on his worn-out couch, he finally opened up. "There's something I haven't told you," he said, voice low, "about the shop. About why I really took it over." My heart picked up. "What do you mean?" He looked down, fiddling with a coffee mug. "It wasn't just about keeping my dad's legacy. It was partly to hold on to him. After he passed, the shop felt like the last piece of him I could keep. But sometimes, it's been really hard not to feel stuck." I reached out and took his hand, surprised by how warm it felt. "You don't have to carry that alone." He met my gaze, eyes shining with something raw and honest. "I know, and I'm trying. Because now, there's more to hold on to." I squeezed his hand, wanting him to know I was there, no matter what shadows lingered in the past. A few days later, we found ourselves wandering the city streets under a sky thick with stars. The air was crisp, and the world felt peaceful in a way it hadn't in ages. Liam stopped suddenly, pulling me close. "I'm glad you walked into that shop that day," he whispered. I smiled, heart full. "Me too." He kissed me then, soft and slow, a promise that whatever stories lay ahead, we'd face them together. And honestly, that felt more like home than any book or vintage shop ever could. That kiss under the stars, that moment where everything seemed to slow down and the city around us faded into a quiet hum, felt like the start of something real, something I'd been waiting for without even knowing it. But as much as I wanted to live in that bubble forever, life had a way of reminding me that even the best stories have their complications. A few days after that night, I showed up at the shop ready to tell Liam how much he meant to me. Instead, I found him sitting behind the counter, his usually bright eyes shadowed, and his hands clenched into fists on the worn wood. "Hey," I said, hesitating by the door. "Everything okay?" He looked up, forcing a small smile that didn't reach his eyes. "Yeah, just a lot on my mind." I stepped closer, feeling the weight of whatever was brewing. "You want to talk about it?" He sighed and leaned back in his chair. "It's about the landlord. There's a chance they might not renew the lease. They want to turn the building into some corporate thing. A chain store, probably." I felt my stomach drop. The shop, the place where we'd found each other, where stories had started to feel like something we could write together, was under threat. "That can't be," I said, my voice sharper than I intended. "This place, it's more than just a building." Liam nodded, running a hand through his hair. "I know, it's my dad's legacy, my legacy now, but fighting it feels overwhelming." I moved to sit across from him, wanting to offer some anchor amid the storm. "We'll figure something out. Together." He met my gaze, and for a moment, I saw a flicker of hope mixed with the fear. "You really mean that?" "Absolutely," I said. "We're a team, right?" He smiled, and this time it was genuine, the kind that warmed the cold edges of worry. Over the next few days, we started brainstorming. We talked to other local businesses, reached out to the community, and even planned a fundraiser. Liam's passion sparked something in me. I realized how much this place meant not just to him, but to everyone who'd ever found refuge in its cramped aisles. One afternoon, as we were taping flyers to the shop's windows, a woman in her 70s stopped by. She introduced herself as Mrs. Callahan, a regular customer who'd been visiting the shop for decades. "This place is a treasure," she said, eyes misty. "I can't imagine the street without it." Liam thanked her, but I could tell he was still worried. That evening, we sat surrounded by stacks of books and half-empty coffee mugs, planning the fundraiser event. Liam looked exhausted, but determined. "I'm glad you're here," he said quietly. "I don't think I could do this alone." I squeezed his hand. "You're not alone." Not now. The fundraiser day arrived with a buzz of energy. The shop was packed. People from all over the neighborhood, showing up to support the little vintage bookstore that had quietly become the heart of the block. There were readings, music, and even a local artist auctioning off pieces inspired by classic novels. Liam was in his element, sharing stories behind the rare books, laughing with customers, and basking in the collective love for the shop. Watching him, I realized how much this place was more than just a business. It was a living, breathing part of the community, much like Liam himself. After the event, as the last few guests trickled out, Liam and I stood by the counter, exhausted but hopeful. "We might have a chance," he said, eyes bright despite the fatigue. I nodded, feeling a surge of pride, not just for him, but for us. That night, as we closed up together, Liam pulled me close in the quiet space between the shelves. "Thank you for believing in me. I don't just believe in you, I believe in us." In that moment, surrounded by the scent of old books and possibility, I knew that no matter what came next, we'd face it side by side. Because some stories, like ours, were worth fighting for, the days after the fundraiser were a mix of hope and uncertainty. We'd managed to rally a solid crowd, collected signatures, and even caught the attention of a local journalist who promised to write a piece about the shop's fight. But the landlord's decision still hung over us like a storm cloud you couldn't shake. Liam threw himself into work with this quiet intensity, cataloging new donations and reorganizing shelves late into the night. I admired that about him, the way he carried the weight without letting it crush him. But I could see the exhaustion in the lines under his eyes, the way he sometimes stared out the window, lost in thought. One evening, I found him sitting on the floor behind the counter, surrounded by stacks of unsorted books, his glasses slipping down his nose. He looked up when I came in, a small smile breaking through the fatigue. "Hey," I said, dropping my bag and sitting beside him. "Hey," he replied, voice soft. "Did you bring more coffee?" "Of course," I grinned, pulling a thermos from my bag. "Thought you might need it." We sipped in companionable silence, the quiet broken only by the rustling of pages and the distant hum of the city outside. "I don't know if I'm ready for this fight," Liam admitted after a while. "What if we lose the shop?" I thought about it, about how much this place meant to both of us. Not just a building, but a home, a sanctuary. "We might lose it," I said honestly, "but I'm not willing to give up without trying everything." He nodded, taking in my words. "You make it easier to believe." That night I realized he wasn't just fighting for the shop. He was fighting for the future, the kind of future that included me. A few days later, Liam invited me to come along to a meeting with the landlord and his representatives. I was nervous, the kind of nervous that twists your stomach and makes your palms sweat. But Liam's calm presence beside me was a steadying force. We sat in a cramped conference room, the landlord's lawyer laying out plans for redevelopment, talking numbers and contracts like the shop was just another asset to be liquidated. Liam spoke up, his voice steady but passionate. He talked about the shop's history, its importance to the community, the people whose lives it had touched. When it was my turn, I found myself standing, heart pounding. I shared how finding the shop had changed me, how Liam's kindness and the stories within those walls had pulled me out of a fog I didn't even realize I was in. There was a silence after I spoke, a quiet that felt heavy with possibility. The landlord's lawyer finally said they'd consider our proposal for a longer lease, but warned it wouldn't be easy. Walking back to the shop, Liam squeezed my hand. "You were incredible." I smiled, feeling that familiar warmth spread through me. "I couldn't have done it without you." That night, as we closed up, Liam surprised me with a small package wrapped in brown paper. Inside was a delicate bookmark, hand-painted with a simple quote, "Every story deserves a chance." "I thought you might like it," he said, watching my face. I traced the words with my finger, feeling like the message was for both of us. The next few weeks were a roller coaster. We kept organizing events, gathering support, and sharing our story online. The community rallied around us in ways I hadn't expected, people donating time, money, and energy. Through it all, Liam and I grew closer. Our relationship deepened not just in romance, but in trust and partnership. We learned each other's rhythms, the way he needed quiet when overwhelmed, the way I craved connection when anxious. One rainy afternoon, as we rearranged a shelf of old classics, our hands brushed, and this electric jolt passed between us. He looked at me, his eyes soft and steady. "I'm scared," he confessed. "Not just about the shop, but everything." "Me too," I admitted, "but we're in this together. And that makes all the difference." He smiled, and I felt like the luckiest guy alive. Then, just as hope was starting to feel real, we got the call. The landlord had rejected our proposal. The shop's days were officially numbered. I don't think I've ever felt such a crushing mix of anger and helplessness. Liam was quiet, stoic, but I could see the heartbreak in his eyes. That night, we sat in the empty shop, surrounded by the memories of decades, and I realized something. This story wasn't over. Not yet, because no matter what happened, we had each other, and sometimes that was the most important story of all. After the call from the landlord, the air in the shop felt heavier, like the walls were holding their breath with us. Liam closed the big front windows, the ones that had welcomed so many curious faces over the years, and for a moment I just stood beside him, taking in the quiet hush of the space that had become more than a store. It was a part of us. We didn't have a grand plan right then, only a stubborn hope that something could still change. But as the days passed, instead of sinking into despair, we started to think about what the shop had really meant to us, and how that spirit could live on, no matter what. One afternoon, Liam surprised me by pulling out an old box from under the counter. Inside were letters, photographs, and journals from his dad, stories about the shop's earliest days, memories tucked away in dusty corners. We spent hours reading through them, piecing together a history that felt like a family legacy, but also a story worth sharing. "I don't want this to end," Liam said quietly, eyes on one faded photo of his dad smiling proudly in front of the shop. "It doesn't have to," I told him. "Maybe it's just the start of a new chapter." We started talking to the community again, but this time with a different idea. What if we could create a cooperative space? A place run by the people who loved it, where the shop could keep its soul without being swallowed by a big corporation or a landlord's bottom line. It wasn't easy. There were meetings, paperwork, and more late nights than either of us cared to count. But each time frustration bubbled up, we reminded each other why we were doing it, not just for the books or the shop, but for the connection, the stories, and the future we wanted to build together. One crisp evening, as the sun dipped low and spilled orange light through the front windows, Liam took my hand and led me to the back of the shop, where a small makeshift sign hung "Community Bookshop, opening soon." I looked at him, surprise and gratitude knocking in my chest. "We're doing this," he said, his smile steady and real. "Together." I squeezed his hand, feeling the warmth of everything we'd been through, the quiet courage it took to believe in something bigger than ourselves. Standing there, surrounded by the scent of worn pages and possibility, I realized the shop had always been more than a place. It was a feeling, a home built from the stories we shared, the people who cared, and the love that quietly grew between us. Liam looked at me then, eyes soft with something unspoken, and I knew that whatever came next, we'd face it side by side. Because sometimes, the best stories aren't about perfect endings. They're about the chapters you write together, one page at a time.